He told him he wasn't good enough for his daughter until the truth was revealed. Andy had always been proud of his family, but they preferred to keep their wealth private. The Smith family had built an international construction empire, but they lived humbly and never flaunted their success. Andy was no different. While attending college far from his hometown, few knew about his background. He wanted to be seen as just another student, not a wealthy heir to a $1 billion company. At school, Andy had met Sarah. She was beautiful, smart, and effortlessly charming. She had plenty of attention from other guys, many of whom were rich and flashy, like Paul, who never missed a chance to show off his luxury cars and shower Sarah with expensive gifts. But Sarah wasn't impressed by Paul. She admired Andy for his down-to-earth personality, his kind nature, and his willingness to help anyone he could. Andy wasn't just good-looking with his muscular build. He was genuine, and that's what drew Sarah to him. She had no idea he had came from wealth, and Andy never brought it up. But there was one problem. Sarah's family had known Paul's family for years. They had business ties, and Sarah's father, Mr. John Walson, had already planned for Sarah to marry Paul. It was an old-fashioned arrangement based more on business than love, and while Sarah disliked the idea, she never argued with her parents. One weekend, Sarah invited Andy to a family barbecue. She was excited for him to meet her parents, though Andy felt a little nervous. When Andy arrived, Mr. Walson eyed Andy with suspicion from the start. He greeted Andy with a firm handshake and wasted no time launching into a series of probing questions. "So, Andy, what does your father do for a living?" Mr. Walson asked, leaning back in his chair with a condescending smirk. Andy, keeping his composure, replied, "My father is in the construction business." At that, Mr. Walson let out a laugh, clearly assuming Andy's father was a lowly construction worker. "Construction, huh? Well, that explains a lot. Let me give you some advice, young man. Sarah has her future laid out for her. She'll be marrying into a proper family. Well, you're not good enough for her." Andy felt his stomach twist. He had never been one to flaunt his background, but the way Mr. Walson spoke down to him made his blood boil. Still, he didn't want to cause a scene. He glanced at Sarah, who was chatting happily with her mother, unaware of what her father was saying. Not wanting to ruin the day, Andy stood up, forcing a polite smile. "I'm not feeling well," he said quietly to Sarah. "I think I should head home." Sarah looked concerned, but she nodded. "Okay, I'll call you later." Andy left the barbecue, feeling humiliated. As he walked away, he could still hear Mr. Walson's dismissive words echoing in his head. He wondered if Sarah's father would ever accept him, or if their relationship was doomed because of the assumptions about his family. A week later, Mr. Walson sat in his living room, sipping coffee as he turned on the news. What he saw next made him drop his mug in shock. The TV anchor reported that Paul's father, the same man Mr. Walson had planned for his daughter to marry into the family of, had been arrested by the FBI. Paul's father had been charged with a slew of crimes, including money laundering, drug trafficking, and bribery. All his assets were frozen, and his company was being seized. The headlines painted a damning picture of Paul's family, a family Mr. Walson had so proudly aligned himself with. He couldn't believe it. All the while, he had rejected Andy, assuming he was beneath his daughter, and had instead welcomed a criminal into their circle. A few days later, Mr. Walson's thoughts were interrupted by breaking news. He turned to see a familiar face on the screen, Michael Smith, the CEO of Spade Construction International. He was in town to sign a major contract for the construction of a new government building. As the cameras followed him at the groundbreaking ceremony, Mr. Walson noticed a young man running up to Michael and giving him a big hug. It was Andy. For a moment, Mr. Walson stared at the screen in disbelief. Then it clicked. Andy's surname was Smith, just like Michael Smith, the head of the international construction firm. He suddenly realized the truth. The construction Andy had mentioned wasn't some small-time job. His father was one of the wealthiest and most respected businessmen in the country. Feeling a mix of guilt and shame, Mr. Walson quickly looked up Michael Smith on his computer. Sure enough, everything confirmed it. Andy was the son of a billionaire, and Mr. Walson had judged him based on false assumptions. Later that week, Mr. Walson invited Andy for dinner, though Andy was hesitant to accept. He didn't know what to expect, but when he arrived, Mr. Walson greeted Andy with a warm smile and shook his hand. "Andy," he said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to judge you, and I see now I couldn't have been more mistaken. I'm truly sorry." Andy was surprised but gracious. He hadn't expected such a turnaround. Mr. Walson continued, "You've shown yourself to be a kind and honorable man, and more importantly, my daughter cares about you. That's what matters." Sarah beamed with happiness, and Andy smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulder. The evening was filled with laughter and good conversation. For the first time, Andy felt accepted, not for his family's wealth, but for who he was. A few months later, Sarah and Andy's relationship grew even stronger, with her parents fully supporting them. Paul, on the other hand, had disappeared from the scene after his father's arrest, leaving behind the superficial life he had tried to impress Sarah with. In the end, it wasn't wealth or status that mattered. It was the values of kindness, humility, and the love that brought Sarah and Andy together.